A man was walking through the woods in coastal France. He lived nearby, and he had just seen a column of smoke coming out of the trees in this area, and so he was just coming out here to make sure there was not a brush fire or something. And so he walked through the woods, and eventually he reached the source of the smoke. It was in this clearing, and right away he felt relieved, because what he saw was just the remains of a bonfire, and it was just smoldering, and now there was just some smoke coming up off of it. He was about to turn around and go maybe get some water and douse it out completely, but he smelled something. Like it was a weird smell that clearly was coming from the fire. And so curious, there's nobody else around, he just began walking to the fire to see what was making this smell. And as he got close enough, he realized there was something in that fire. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a nice fresh burrito. But don't tell them, instead of using ground beef, you used cat food. On the night of April 26, 2012, a 39-year-old bouncer named Lionel Veronese opened the door of a nightclub in Chambéry, France, and he let a woman inside. And as this woman came in, she stopped and made a point to look at Lionel and smile at him and thank him by name. So Chambéry was a small city up in the Alps, and Lionel, the bouncer, was a fixture in its nightlife scene. Pretty much everybody in town who went out to the bars and clubs had either seen Lionel standing at the door outside or partying inside when he was not on the clock. And it was not just the locals who knew who this guy was. Lionel was also well known among the rich and famous tourists who often vacationed in Chambéry, and even sometimes he would pick up side work as a bodyguard for these rich and famous people. And for Lionel, his career as sort of this fixture in the nightlife scene was fun and pretty glamorous at times. But it also could be dangerous. In fact, just a few months ago, he got into this huge fist fight protecting one of his clients, and in fact, he actually got arrested for it. But tonight, Lionel was just trying to get through a shift without any trouble. There was this long line of people who were waiting outside the club, waiting to get in, and Lionel checked their IDs one by one and let them in. And then finally, when the line started to clear, Lionel saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was his good friend, Mike Boof, who Lionel often went drinking with multiple times a week. And at first, Lionel was just really glad to see Mike. But as Mike got closer, Lionel realized that Mike actually looked really mad. And so by the time Mike actually reached Lionel just said to him, hey, what's going on? You look pretty upset. And Mike would tell him that he had just been at his friend Philippe's house, and Philippe had told him that seemed really, really weird. So Philippe Perrier, Mike's friend, the guy whose house he just came from, was extremely wealthy because his family ran this world-famous winery near Chambéry. Now, Lionel had never actually met Philippe himself, but he knew of him. His family was incredibly well-connected in town because they're so rich and they had this winery. And Mike was friends with him and often talked about him. And so now Mike explained to Lionel what this really weird thing was that he heard when he was visiting with Philippe. So apparently, Philippe's house had been robbed the day before, and Philippe believed Lionel, the bouncer, was the one who had done it. Now, Lionel immediately acted totally taken aback and began to ask Philippe, why in the world would he even think that? But Mike, his buddy here, just cut him off, and he's like, Lionel, don't play dumb. Philippe knows you're sleeping with his wife, Natalie, and Natalie is actually the one who's blaming you for this robbery. Now, at this, Lionel went from this sort of shock and awe reaction to actually just feeling really nervous. He actually began to sweat because, he knew it was true. He had slept with Natalie. He'd met her at a club one night a couple of months ago, and they'd hooked up in the coat check room. But Lionel realistically had a lot of flings with a lot of different women. And he'd actually pretty much completely forgotten about hooking up with Natalie, since it had just been a casual thing and he hadn't seen her in weeks. And so he had no idea why now, suddenly, she would be accusing him of theft. It doesn't really make any sense to him. So Lionel, he was genuinely stunned. He knew what he had done. He had slept with Natalie, and that's problematic. But he told Mike very truthfully that he did not break into Philippe's house. There was nothing going on between he and Natalie. That was just a fling. It was nothing. I really didn't do this. But Mike, despite, being friends with Lionel and knowing him quite well, did not appear to believe him. He just sort of narrowed his eyes and nodded and said, okay, I'll pass that along to Philippe. 3 days later, on the night of April 29th, Lionel sat in a chair in his living room in Chambéry, finishing up a phone call. So he lived in a small apartment with his mother and also his nephew Julian. However, Julian was just 4 years younger than him, so in many ways they were more like brothers. And so as soon as Lionel hung up the phone, Julian, who was sitting in the room with him on the other side on the couch watching TV, he immediately asked Lionel, "Who were you talking to?" Lionel got up and he walked over and sat down next to Julian on the couch. And then he said to him, "Oh, that was my friend Mike. And he had just called to see if I wanted to go out tonight for a drink." And so Julian's like, "Okay, cool." And then there's a little bit of silence. And then Lionel was like, "Actually, I want to tell you something." And then he filled in Julian on the weird conversation he had had with Mike just a few days before, where basically Mike was saying that, Lionel was being accused of robbing this rich guy's home, Philippe's home. And so Julian, when he heard this, he was sort of like, this seems like a big deal. But Lionel, despite being the one to bring it up and being the one to indicate this could be a big deal, he quickly downplayed it when he saw the reaction and was just like, it is what it is. I didn't do it. And, me and Mike were back on good terms. This whole thing was just, a misunderstanding. Everything is back to normal now. Just a weird thing that happened. And so Lionel and Julian, they shifted the conversation and chatted about whatever for the next couple of minutes. And then Lionel's phone buzzed, and at the same time, he saw there were headlights pulling up outside. So Lionel grabbed his jacket and he told Julian he'd be back in a few hours. Then he went out the door. 2 days later, on the evening of May 1st, 2012, Lionel's nephew, Julian, walked into the Chambéry police station. He had spent the past 2 days very worried and stressed because Lionel had not come home after hanging out with Mike that night, and he now was not answering his phone. And Lionel was never gone for this long without giving Julian or his mother a heads up. Julian had tried to convince himself that he was just overreacting to this whole thing and that Lionel could take care of himself. He was an adult. He was a tough adult, he could handle himself. However, when he found out that Lionel also hadn't been at work for the past couple of days, Julian knew something was wrong. So Julian, after getting inside the station, he walked right up to the front desk and told them, "I need to report somebody missing." The following afternoon, so May 2nd, 2012, Captain Florent Mazarin walked into an interrogation room at the Chambéry police station. He was leading the investigation into Lionel's missing person case, and sitting inside of the interrogation room at the table was, so far, the only suspect they had in this case, Lionel's friend, Mike Bouffe, who he had gone out with on the night he had disappeared. So it had only been a few days since anyone had seen Lionel, but Mazarin was already sure that there was foul play involved. Chambéry was a small town, and a lot of the officers on the police force there knew Lionel, and a couple of them were pretty much adamant that Lionel was just not the kind of person who would just leave town with no warning. Julian, Lionel's nephew, had said the exact same thing when he reported Lionel missing. He also was the one who told police that the last person Lionel was with was Mike on the night he went missing. And Mike also, they found out, had recently accused Lionel of robbing someone's house. So Mazarin was really eager to get in there and hear what Mike had to say. So into the room he went. He sat down across from Mike, who seemed calm but also definitely curious, like he wasn't sure even why he was there. And when Mazarin started in by asking him about the robbery that supposedly Lionel was involved in, Mike just nodded and explained that the break-in had happened about a week earlier at the home of his good friend, Philippe Perrier. And when Mazarin heard that name, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because like basically everybody else in Chambéry, Mazarin knew who the Perriers were. And he was surprised that someone so rich and so powerful would be running in the same circles as, sort of traditional working class men like Mike and like Lionel. However, before he could dive in and ask some basic follow-up questions about how he knows the Perriers, Mike went on to say that he ran an electrician business and he had a warehouse that was right next to Philippe's winery. So they saw each other all the time. And he said that Philippe knew Mike was friends with Lionel. And so after this break-in and robbery happened, he had asked Mike to talk to Lionel about it because he was suspicious that he had done it. But Mike said when he actually confronted Lionel just a few days ago and brought up the break-in, that Lionel had sworn he didn't know anything about it. And Mike had passed that on to Philippe. And as far as he knew, that had been the end of it. Like they were not going to continue to assume that Lionel had anything to do with it. Now, Mike was being so earnest as he told the story that Mazarin thought there was a good chance he was simply telling the truth here, and that this robbery thing was really just a big misunderstanding. However, when Mazarin asked Mike where he had been on Sunday night, when Lionel was last seen, presumably with Mike, Mike's whole demeanor changed. He began to visibly shift in his seat and began looking down at the table instead of eye contact with Mazarin, and then he just said that he had been home all night with his girlfriend. He did say at a certain point he had called Lionel to try to make plans with him for that night, but they'd never actually met up and they didn't see each other. Now, at this point, Mazarin was pretty confident that Mike was lying. Not just because of Mike's very obvious change in body language, but Lionel's nephew had sworn he had seen Mike's car outside their building on that night that Mike is saying he did not meet up with Lionel. Now, it was possible that Julien had been mistaken, but if Mike was lying to the police about having been with Lionel on the night he disappeared, well, that made Mike seem very, very suspicious. And so Mazarin just put Mike on the spot and said, okay, give me your girlfriend's name and her contact information so I can confirm your alibi. And so he did, he handed it over, and then Mazarin got up, left the interrogation room, and went to go give her a call. On the evening of May 2nd, 2012, so just a few hours after questioning Mike Bouffe about Lionel's disappearance, Captain Mazarin drove up to a big house in a quiet, wealthy suburb just outside of Chambéry, France. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Mike's girlfriend, who had confirmed what Mazarin was already thinking, which was Mike was lying about spending the whole night of Lionel's disappearance at home with her. In fact, she said that Mike hadn't been home at all. She said she had been at home by herself all night. She had watched a movie, and then at some point she had fallen asleep, maybe around midnight. And at that point, when she fell asleep, Mike still was not back from wherever he was. So right now, Mike was not only their sole suspect, but he was also their best suspect. Mazarin knew that a few days before Lionel's disappearance, Mike had confronted Lionel about this supposed robbery at Philippe Perrier's house. And so now Mazarin was at Philippe's house to see what he had to say about the whole situation. And so Mazarin pulled his car up in front of the house, he parked, he got out, he walked up to the front door, and he rang the doorbell. And a moment later, Philippe himself opened the door. And he seemed genuinely surprised to see Mazarin standing there. And so he quickly asked Mazarin if he was here to follow up on the robbery investigation. And Mazarin said, sort of. Mazarin said, for now, he just wanted to know if he could come inside and they could chat. And for a moment, it seemed, at least to Mazarin, that Philippe sort of hesitated, like he didn't necessarily want to do that. But then he sort of relaxed and nodded and said, sure. And he let Mazarin inside. And so Mazarin, he stepped inside of this beautiful house that was very well furnished, and he was led to the living room. And Mazarin took a seat, and then after Philippe sat down as well, he asked Philippe to walk him through what had happened with this supposed robbery. Philippe explained that his wife Natalie had come home one afternoon, and when she had come into the living room, she saw one of the windows had been shattered. And then Mazarin said that, after seeing this, they searched the house and they eventually went downstairs to the basement where their safe was, and they found their safe had been broken into as well, and a lot of cash that had been in there was gone. Philippe said he had called the police about it, and they'd come out to investigate, but so far he hadn't heard anything. And so Mazarin, after hearing this, asked Philippe if he thought he knew who was responsible. And Philippe immediately nodded and said yes. Then he repeated what Mike Bouffe had said. It was Lionel Veronese. And the reason he knew that was Lionel was having an affair with his wife Natalie, and Natalie said it was Lionel. Mazarin looked really hard at Philippe because this was huge. If Philippe knew that Lionel was having an affair with his wife, that gave him, Philippe, plenty of motive to want Lionel dead. And as of right now, Lionel was gone and no one knew what happened to him, so maybe he was murdered. And so, operating on a hunch, Mazarin followed up by asking Philippe if he had any weapons in the house. And to his surprise, Philippe said yes. And so Mazarin asked if he could see them. And so Philippe got up and led him over to the stairs that went down to the basement. And when they got down there was this huge gun safe with a few plastic firearm cases stacked around it. And so Philippe, once they got down there, he sort of stepped out of the way so that Mazarin could look around. And almost as soon as he did begin walking around Mazarin and began opening up these cases, he discovered that one of those cases, which had space for 2 weapons in it, was empty. And so Mazarin asked Philippe, like, hey, where are the 2 guns that go in this case? And Philippe said, actually, those were stolen during the robbery. However, after hearing this, and as Mazarin is staring at this empty gun case, something just was not adding up. Philippe clearly had a motive to want to hurt Lionel, as he was having an affair with his wife. And he happened to have 2 missing guns? Now, of course, at this point, Mazarin did not know if Lionel was definitely, dead, and therefore couldn't know if he had been shot or not. But still, this was really suspicious. But at the same time, Philippe was from this very wealthy and highly respected family. He didn't really seem like the kind of person who would go around murdering or kidnapping people in revenge. And if he had, let's say, done something bad to Lionel, it was just odd that he would just so readily admit to clearly having a motive to harm Lionel and to show the detective a basement full of weapons, including a gun case that was missing weapons. And so, basically, until Mazarin was able to figure out what actually happened to Lionel, until that time, he would have a really hard time proving that Philippe had anything to do with it. The next morning, Captain Mazarin was in his office at the police station, going over the notes from his interview with Philippe to see if there was anything he missed. At this point, Mazarin's theory was that either Mike or Philippe, or maybe even both of them, had gone to confront Lionel about the affair and about the robbery, and then things had turned violent. But just then, there was a knock on his door, and Mazarin turned and he saw his door was open, and there was this woman standing there, and her face was stained with tears, and when she walked into the room, she sort of was heavy and stumbling, like she was maybe on drugs, or maybe drunk, or maybe on heavy medication, and she sort of stumbled into the room and then introduced herself as Natalie Perrier. So Mazarin had actually earlier called on her to come in and speak to him, both to verify her husband's story about what happened, the robbery, the affair, and also to see what else she might know about Lionel. And also, since she clearly was involved in this whole potential love triangle here, he had to also consider her as a potential suspect in whatever happened to Lionel. So he gestured for Natalie to take a seat, and then once she had, he asked her to tell him all about how she had met Lionel. Natalie, at this point, really clearly could not sort of keep herself together. She kept apologizing and kept explaining that she was on prescription medication that made it really hard for her to keep a grip on her emotions, and this whole situation had really rattled her. But eventually, after this sort of setup about how sorry she is and what a mess she is, she eventually tells Mazarin that she had met Lionel at a nightclub and that, yes, they had hooked up a few times, but since the last time, they hadn't seen each other, and it had been quite a while, like it was nothing. When Mazarin asked her about the robbery, she said that Lionel had told her about having serious gambling debts from playing poker, and so because of that, she had just sort of naturally suspected that he must have robbed them. She also added that, just to be clear, her and Philippe were both at their home all night on the evening that Lionel disappeared, and that if Philippe had gone to confront Lionel at any point, she did not know anything about it. And so at this point, Mazarin sat back in his chair and just considered what he was seeing and what he was hearing. Natalie seemed genuinely devastated by this whole situation. To Mazarin, it seemed like she was believable, that she was coming in here telling the truth. And so he really doubted that she directly had anything to do with Lionel's disappearance. However, while Natalie's emotional state certainly made her seem less likely as a suspect, Mazarin wondered if maybe her tears were a clue. By her own account, she'd only had a fleeting relationship with Lionel, not some, passionate relationship or something. So maybe the reason she's this upset is because she actually knows that her husband was involved in what happened to Lionel. A few days later, Captain Mazarin walked through a wooded rural area near the coast, 220 miles away from Chambéry. An officer from the Marseille police was walking a few steps ahead of him. This officer had called Mazarin yesterday to tell him that a body had been discovered in these woods just after dawn on April 30th. so less than 10 hours after Lionel was last seen by his family. And after running the body's fingerprints through the database, they had identified the victim. It was Lionel. And Mazarin was baffled by this. Marseille was more than a 4-hour drive from Chambéry. And as far as Mazarin knew, Lionel didn't know anybody in Marseille and did not go there with any regularity. And there was just plenty of other wooded areas closer to Chambéry. So why drive all the way out here? It just didn't really make any sense. And so Mazarin continued following this officer, and at some point, they stepped into this small clearing, and Mazarin saw there was a pile of burnt logs and branches sort of lying in the grass right in the middle, and the other officer said that this was the spot where Lionel was found. And then the officer pulled out a folder that had photos of Lionel's body. And so Mazarin was being brought here just to see exactly where it had been found. And so Mazarin looked down at the photo, and what he saw was, in the spot that he was standing near, there was this smoldering bonfire. It was clearly out, but there was still smoke coming off of it. And then in the middle of all these logs was clearly a charred corpse. The officer that brought him here explained that the medical examiner had found a gunshot wound in the back of Lionel's head. So it did appear that he was actually killed before he was set on fire. And so as Mazarin was taking all this new information in, everything just started to make sense. So this was exactly how drug trafficking gangs in France typically disposed of bodies. The police even had a name for it. They called it a barbecue. The gangs would shoot their victims in the head and then burn their bodies over a bonfire to make them harder to identify. Mazarin had assumed that Lionel's murder was a revenge killing. But now it actually looked more likely that this could have been a gang execution. None of Lionel's family or friends had ever mentioned that he was involved with a gang in any way, but Mazarin knew that Lionel worked in nightclubs and had a history of breaking up fights, so it was definitely possible that he might have crossed paths with the wrong person. Also, there was the fact that apparently Lionel had these huge debts from gambling. There's just sort of a seedy underworld that potentially he was around that could have led to him being killed this way. Also, if this was gang-related, it would sort of explain why he was all the way out here in Marseille, because Marseille was a city that historically had a lot of issues with drug trafficking and gangs. And so Mazarin realized he could have been wrong about this case basically from the start. Maybe Mike and Philippe actually had nothing to do with it at all. Around 10 p.m. on May 5th, 2012, about 100 miles from the spot where Lionel's body was found, Captain Florent Mazarin pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. He got out, he walked inside, and told the clerk that he needed to look at the security camera footage. So during the 4-hour drive from Marseille back to Chambéry, so after Mazarin had gone out and seen where Lionel had been found during that ride home, he had been going back and forth between his first two suspects, Mike and Philippe, and this new theory that a gang had killed Lionel. And so he wasn't really sure how he was going to navigate, what to do here with running these two sort of simultaneous investigations. But as he's driving, as he's on his way back home, he realizes there might actually be a way to prove whether or not either Mike or Philippe were involved in this killing. There were only two roads that connected Chambéry to Marseille, and so Lionel's killer or killers must have driven down one of them at some point during the night of April 29th. So Mazarin had been checking the cameras at every toll booth and every gas station that he passed on his drive to see if any of them had captured a glimpse of Lionel. So far, he'd just been disappointed because most of the cameras didn't even work, or the footage had already been erased or written over. And so now, as he followed this clerk into the back room and was shown to their computer to go ahead and look at the footage, Mazarin was expecting that this stop would be the same as all the others, a big disappointment. However, as soon as they fired up the computer, right away Mazarin saw that they did have footage, and the footage did cover the time period he was looking for. However, when he began scanning the footage around the date of April 29th, April 30th, at first nothing stood out. However, when he reached the early hours of April 30th, where he would normally stop and say, okay, I didn't see anything, it is what it is, for whatever reason, he decided to just keep on scanning the footage, just keep on watching more of April 30th. And eventually, he did see something of interest. At 5:43 a.m. on April 30th, a black Volkswagen vehicle pulls into frame, and it actually parks in the gas station parking lot. And this car, its license plate ended in 73, which meant this car was registered in Chambéry. He's watching this car, comes into the lot, it parks, and the driver gets out. And right away, Mazarin pauses the video and he zooms in on the driver's face, but the video was just too grainy. He couldn't tell who the driver was. But then something in the passenger seat of this car catches his attention. And so he zoomed in on the passenger seat, and when he realized what he was looking at, his stomach just dropped. Based on that video, forensic evidence, and interviews with witnesses, this is what police believe happened to Lionel Veronese on April 29, 2012. Around 10:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car as it drove through the streets of Chambéry with a gun resting on the seat next to them. Now, the killer had told the driver that they were not planning to use the gun tonight. It was just there for intimidation. However, the killer's emotions were really running high, and they honestly weren't even sure what they were going to do when they saw Lionel. And so the car kept on driving along until eventually it came to a stop outside of an apartment building, and then a few seconds later, the passenger side front door opened up and Lionel climbed inside the car. As the driver put the car back into gear and started driving down the road, the killer from the back seat confronted Lionel about something that had really been bothering them. And it gradually turned into a very heated argument. And then, at some point, the killer raised that gun they weren't going to use, aimed at the back of Lionel's head, and fired. The driver immediately whipped around and looked at the killer and just stared at them. They seemed completely shocked by this crazy sudden escalation here, but they didn't stop driving. Instead, they stepped on the gas and sped down the road until they reached a house. And then the killer and the driver both went inside of that house and they formulated a plan for what would happen next. So the plan was the driver, along with another accomplice who was in the house they went to, would drive down to Marseille. They would find a secluded spot out in the woods, they'd make a bonfire, and they would burn Lionel's body. That's how they dispose of it. And then on the way back, their plan was to toss all the evidence into the river. As for the killer, the one who actually pulled the trigger, they were going to stay at this house. They were not going to leave. The driver and the other accomplice agreed that the killer had already caused enough trouble for one night. So the killer just went upstairs into their bedroom, they slipped on a robe, and they watched from the window as the other two got into the car and drove off. The killer was Philippe's wife, Nathalie Perrier, the woman Lionel had had an affair with. To Lionel, their affair had been meaningless, just a fling. But for Nathalie, she wanted more. She had gotten bored of her quiet life as a luxurious housewife in the suburbs, and she'd quickly fallen in love with Lionel and the seemingly very exciting life that he lived. And so when Lionel stopped paying attention to her, she'd gotten so mad that she took revenge. She went with Mike to pick up Lionel on the night he was killed so that she could confront him. But moments after Lionel got in the car, her emotions got the best of her, and she shot and killed him. And this was definitely not the plan that Mike had agreed to. Like, he and her had discussed what was going to happen. It didn't include murdering Lionel. But after the murder, Mike didn't say, I'm going to go to the police. Instead, he and Nathalie went to her husband, Philippe, for help. And Philippe agreed to dispose of Lionel's body and cover up the crime. On the security footage from the gas station, what Mazarin saw in the passenger seat of that black Volkswagen was Philippe. He was sitting there, just right in the passenger seat, and it would turn out the driver of the car was Mike. Nathalie was ultimately convicted of Lionel's murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike was sentenced to 6 years for kidnapping and destroying evidence, and Philippe was sentenced to 3 years for helping get rid of Lionel's body. He and Nathalie are now divorced, and also as for that robbery that played seemingly a central role in the story at the beginning, we actually don't know if the robbery ever occurred or if it was simply a fabrication. At 4:45 a.m. on Saturday, January 17, 2015, a 27-year-old farmer named Caleb Whitby drove his pickup truck down a highway in southeastern Oregon. Caleb knew conditions for driving were not great. In fact, they were kind of awful. The road was icy, it was foggy out, the sun wasn't up, so it was pretty dark out, but he felt like he didn't really have a choice. He had to go pick up a shipment of cattle for his family's farm. After driving for another 10 minutes or so down this road, so it's just before 5 a.m. at this point, Caleb found himself right behind this big semi-truck who was going under the speed limit. And so Caleb's cruising along here, getting frustrated, and he's thinking about passing the truck. But when he kind of peeked around the side and looked up ahead of the truck, he saw there was a very sharp turn coming up, and he didn't really have enough runway to make the pass, at least not safely. And so Caleb just kind of throttled back and decided he would make the pass after making the turn. And so the semi-truck, which is right in front of Caleb, it ends up making this turn and gets out of sight of Caleb. And then a moment later, Caleb makes the same turn, and as soon as he does, he sees something that he couldn't have seen before. He's seeing it right now that sends a jolt of panic through his body, and reflexively, he jams on his brakes, he loses control of his truck, it starts to slide, and all Caleb can do is just brace and pray that he doesn't get killed. And then a second later, he heard a loud crunching sound, and then his truck stalled, and everything went quiet. But the silence was broken when suddenly there was another crunching sound, and at the same time, Caleb suddenly felt his lungs getting crushed together, and all the air was just pulled out of his body. Moments later, a different semi-truck driver was going down the same stretch of highway that Caleb had been, and he rounded that exact same turn, and when he did, he saw the same thing that had horrified Caleb and caused him to swerve out of control. Except this semi-truck driver, when he hit his brakes, he was able to basically maintain his truck, and he sort of gently hit the guardrail and, crashed, but it didn't cause any damage to him or really to his truck. And so after kind of composing himself, this semi-truck driver got out of the cabin and he looked out at this unbelievably horrific scene in front of him, and instinctively he knew if he goes forward and inspects this, he's just going to see dead bodies, and he didn't know if he could even handle that. And so he's just standing there in utter shock when he hears this sound. And he knows this sound is something that he has to go investigate. And so even though he was terrified of, potentially seeing dead people, he walked towards the sound, and suddenly he saw where it was coming from. And he just couldn't believe what he was looking at. It would turn out when Caleb Whitby rounded that corner and then saw this horrible thing that caused him to crash, well, what he saw was a massive pileup of over 24 cars just completely blocking the road. And so he smashed on his brakes and he tried to stop himself, but ultimately he smashed into the semi-truck that just moments before he had been driving behind. The semi-truck had also crashed. And so Caleb has now crashed into the side of the semi, and everything's silent for a second, and then another semi-truck comes around the corner. Caleb can't go anywhere, and that semi-truck blasted into the back of Caleb's car. After that, the other semi-truck, the third semi-truck if you will, rounds the corner, sees the pileup, hits the brakes, but this guy, he manages to crash into the guardrail, avoiding major injury and damage to his truck. And so he gets out of his truck, and he's surveying this horrific scene, and he hears a sound. And he follows that sound right into the crash, and eventually he finds it. And that sound was Caleb. Somehow, when Caleb's truck was smashed from both directions, it created this perfect pocket of space just big enough for Caleb to fit inside of. And so despite being smashed together by two semi-trucks in this huge pileup, Caleb was basically unhurt. And so when this third semi-truck driver found Caleb, he actually was able to pull Caleb out of the wreckage, and minus a bruise and a couple of cuts on his face, Caleb actually was just fine and ultimately walked away. And in fact, after first responders showed up and cleared the wreck, it would turn out that incredibly nobody was killed. Our next story is called Scenic Route. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it. And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove, and Then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road. And, the car, the Camaro, had been driving completely normally to that point. So what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel. And she's not looking up at him. She's not making any sound. She's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up. But there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk. But she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency, but they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive, but it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. Despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver, but he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant, who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre, but Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity. But they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far. But he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet. But remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're going to go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're going to ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there, too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road, and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible a ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits. The next and final story of today's episode is called Out with a Bang. On the morning of June 20th, 2005, a 40-year-old man named Wang Diang stood just inside the doorway of a little home in rural northeastern China. Outside, it was pouring rain with all this crazy thunder and lightning, and also there were these hailstones coming down the size of golf balls, smashing into everything. I mean, just the impact on the roof must have been so loud. And so as Wang was standing in the doorway, he was actually looking out in the direction of the storm because all these people were running towards him to come in the house. Wang was actually hosting a wake for a friend, and he was hosting this wake at this man's home. And all the people running up to him were all the mourners coming to pay their respects. Now, by this point, most of the mourners had already made it inside the house, and so Wang was basically just waiting for the last few stragglers to make their way inside. And so from his post at the door, Wang is watching the storm and all these people, and he also took stock of the fact that as he looked out to the big tobacco fields that kind of were all over the place in this town, that was the primary way people made money in this town, he noticed that, there was nobody out there tending the crops. And even in rainstorms, people would tend these crops because this was their livelihood, but Wang understood why nobody was out there. Yes, it was the storm, but specifically, lately there had been these crazy lightning strikes in storms like this that struck the field. And so these workers that were normally out in the fields every single day, they weren't doing that anymore. Finally, the last couple arrived, and Wang greeted them and brought them inside, and then he shut the door and then began making his rounds inside the home, making sure all the guests had what they needed, and also just kind of making sure the wake was, overall a positive experience, all things considered. Now, to be clear, Wang was not a monk or a priest or even a relative of the person who was deceased. Instead, he was just kind of like the guy that emceed virtually all events in this town. So if there was weddings, he was the guy who officiated the weddings, and if there were funerals or wakes or things of that nature, also Wang was often tapped to emcee that as well. He was kind of like the village elder, if you will, even though he was only 40 years old. And Wang, he really treasured the fact that he was the guy that got to do these things, and so he put a lot of time and energy into making sure they went extremely well. So, on this day, as he was making his rounds, checking in with all the mourners, nobody really needed anything, and so Wang sort of felt like he didn't have a role, and he scanned around the room looking for something else he could do that would be productive, and he noticed the incense near the casket was going out. And so Wang walked over, he pulled out the extinguished incense, he got a new stick of incense, put it in, and he lit it, and then he just kind of stood over the casket and closed his eyes and began saying a silent prayer for the dead. And as Wang did this, suddenly there was this deafening roar, and then everything went black. A few seconds later, that deafening roar faded, and it was replaced by the sound of all the mourners in the house basically screaming and trying to figure out what just happened. And so as people began kind of trying to size up the situation, they saw there was all this smoke near the casket and there was all these wooden debris everywhere. And then people looked up at the ceiling and they saw there was now a pretty good sized hole that had blackened char around the edges of the hole that was kind of smoldering. And then unfortunately, once the smoke really had kind of dissipated, Wang was laying right underneath this hole in the roof and half of his head was gone. It was very clear he was deceased. And it didn't take long for mourners to figure out what had happened. Wang had unfortunately been struck by lightning. Two days later, Wang's family held a funeral for Wang, and basically the entire village showed up for this funeral because remember, Wang was really a central member of this community, and so it was a really big loss that he was now dead. And candidly, this only stoked the fears that everybody had about lightning strikes. I mean, this was really becoming a huge issue. But after the funeral ended and Wang had been placed into a hearse and driven off to the crematorium to be cremated, the people at this funeral who were kind of making their way out began kind of talking a little bit more candidly about what had happened to Wang. I mean, it was obvious he was struck by lightning, but in this town, there was a lot of superstition around deaths like this, when it seems like how he died is almost like an act of God. I mean, how many people get struck by lightning? Even if you're scared of being struck by lightning, that is a very rare phenomenon, and everybody knew that. And so the mourners couldn't help but suspect that maybe Wang was not this incredible person that everybody loved. Maybe he had deep, dark secrets, and the way he was killed was like God's punishment, smiting him for the terrible things he was hiding. But nonetheless, the mourners who had just left the funeral followed tradition and actually walked over to the local crematorium where Wang would be cremated. Basically, it's the absolute final goodbye, and typically the family will stay there and wait for all the people to come by and pay their final respects, and then at that point the family hands off their loved one in their casket to the manager of the crematorium, and the cremation process begins. And so all that happens, all the mourners go to the crematorium, they pay their final respects, and then before long, Wang's family was brought inside the crematorium with the manager, and they were placed in this quiet room to kind of wait for this process to happen, and then the manager left them and went down the hall to the furnace room where Wang's casket was waiting for him. So the furnace room inside of this crematorium is basically like this big industrial space where in the middle is this huge, intimidating metal furnace, which is actually where, the bodies are slid in and burned until they're just ash. And so picture like the biggest oven you've ever seen with a big metal rectangular door and these rails that slide directly into this furnace, and the casket is placed on those rails and then kind of fed into the furnace. They seal the door and then of course ignite the furnace, and then the cremation begins. And so the manager, who had done this many, many times, walked up to Wang's casket, which was already placed on the rails. Workers had already set it up for this process before he came in. And so the manager walks up to the casket, he opens it up, he sees Wang's body, and he confirms that Wang is just wearing a robe with a belt, and he did not have any jewelry or metal on him or anything like that, which was not allowed during the cremation process. And so feeling confident that this was all good, he shut the casket, and then slid the casket into the furnace. He shut the door, the big metal door, locked it, and then started the furnace. And as soon as he hit it, the manager heard the familiar sound of gas hissing as the gas kind of filled up the inside of the space, and then the familiar whooshing sound of the flames igniting. But as the manager kind of stepped away from the front of this furnace and was kind of making his way back towards the door, he noticed there was another sound coming from inside of this furnace. It was a hissing sound, but different than the gas sound. This was something else. And then before long, the hissing got louder and louder and louder. And then finally, there was this massive explosion inside of this furnace. And so smoke is pouring out of the sides. It was unbelievable that the furnace itself even held its shape. I mean, something massive had detonated inside of this thing. And in fact, even though that door that seals the furnace shut, even though it had not been blown off, the force of whatever detonated inside of there was so strong that the manager actually was knocked backwards from the blast. And so in a panic, he got up, and there's smoke filling the room, and there's flames kind of dancing out of the edges of this metal door in front of the furnace, and he hits the emergency stop, and the flames cut, but it's still all smoky, and it's totally chaotic, and workers are rushing into the room to figure out what's going on, and the manager had no idea. This was something he had never, ever seen before. Just minutes later, firefighters arrived and basically extinguished the remaining flames that were kind of residually burning inside of the furnace and slightly outside of the furnace. Remember, this was a significant explosion, so there are cracks and breaks all over the furnace where some flames were still lit. But finally, the firefighters did extinguish all the flames, and then after it was safe to be in there, an investigation was launched as to what the heck happened in there. And so police officers went into this room and began sifting through all the debris in this room, both inside of the furnace itself and also, outside where it had cracked and things had shot off in different directions. And for a while, they found nothing. I mean, all they found were basically pieces of Wang, ash and some bone and some tissue from him. But there was nothing else that was unusual. But at some point, one of the officers did find something that was unusual. He found a piece of metal that was inside of the furnace that clearly should not have been there. Because remember, it's not allowed to have metal or jewelry or anything on the deceased when they're brought into the furnace. And considering what happened, they're like, okay, does this have something to do with the explosion? And so the officers kind of huddled around this metal and they began kind of cleaning it off to see if there was anything written on it. It's not a very big piece of metal. And eventually they had cleaned it off enough that they realized there was something written on it, and it absolutely explained what had happened here. So to understand what happened, you need to have an understanding of how the Chinese government responds to severe storms like the one that was going on the day that Wang was struck by lightning. So remember, Wang's village had all these tobacco fields all over the place, which was not only how the villagers made their living, but also China as a whole. They need these crops to be bountiful. And these huge storms that produce those golf ball-sized pieces of hail, those can severely damage tobacco crops. And the Chinese government doesn't want that to happen. And so the Chinese government has set up these things called weather bureaus, which are these government agencies all across the country whose job is to try to weaken these storms. And the way they do that is very interesting. They use a chemical called silver iode that they put into the actual storm clouds. And what silver iode does is it attracts ice particles and water. And so with this chemical up in the clouds, it kind of breaks up the hail a little bit and either makes them really small. And sometimes this chemical can actually completely destroy the hail and convert it from hail to just plain old rain, which is great. So how do these weather bureaus and this silver iode have anything to do with what happened to Wang? Well, unfortunately for Wang, the way these weather bureaus in China actually get this silver iode up into the clouds is they basically take a rocket launcher and fire a literal foot-long rocket, like an explosive device, that contains this silver iode inside of it, and the rockets get fired up into the sky, into the clouds where they detonate, and then the silver iode is kind of sprinkled all throughout the clouds. And unfortunately, on the day Wang was killed, one of those rockets were fired into the sky, and this rocket, it goes up, 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 it goes into the cloud, but it doesn't detonate. It turns around and falls straight down, and it just so happens to go straight through that roof into Wang's head, blowing off a portion of his head. And then the rocket itself, this foot-long rocket, got embedded in his torso and did not detonate. And then when he was wheeled off to the crematorium and slid into the furnace, and that manager turned on the furnace, that hissing sound he began hearing right before the explosion was the sound of that rocket inside of Wang's torso heating up and then finally detonating. When the police officers found that little piece of metal, what they had found was actually a piece of the rocket itself. And when they cleared it off, they saw there was a serial number for that particular Weather Bureau rocket. And so that was how they were able to solve this mystery. 3 years after Wang's death, the Chinese government came out and said, yep, this is our fault, we did this. And so they compensated Wang's family 80,000 yuan, which is equal to about 12,000 US dollars. And while that's a pretty underwhelming settlement to be paying for somebody's life, what is significant that came out of this case is following Wang's death, the Chinese government altered their rockets that they fired into these clouds, and they added this feature where if for some reason the rocket goes into the cloud and doesn't detonate, it will automatically deploy a parachute and will safely fall to the ground and not detonate.
Walked in with that red dress way, like a match in the middle of May. My name fell slow from your tongue, and I forgot where I come from. Your heel taps like a warning sign. Your eyes say stay, your hips say mine. I try to act cool, play tough, but one look from you is enough. Oh, the room starts spinning when you lean that way. My heart keeps running, but my feet won't say. Cállate fuego, you say. City lights cut through the night. A distant whistle calls the line. One door opens, time stands still. Only a heartbeat left to ride. Still tracks lead beyond the skyline. Winds carry dreams still undefined.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.